Welcome to Notebook Summaries. Today, we're digging into the long and really complex history of Myanmar, a nation that seems to be defined by a repeating and often tragic cycle of unity, division, and conflict. Okay, so to get a handle on Myanmar, it helps to break its history down into these major periods. As we walk through them, you're going to see a powerful pattern emerge. The rise of these incredible empires, then the massive disruption of colonial rule, and finally, a long, incredibly difficult struggle for stability that is, still going on today. So we'll trace this story through 6 key chapters. We'll start with the early kingdoms and bring it all the way up to the turmoil of recent years, and hopefully see how the echoes of the past are still shaping Myanmar's present. Right, let's start at the very beginning. Our story kicks off in the fertile Irrawaddy Valley, which is where the first civilizations really laid the groundwork for the entire nation. So the first people we really have records of were the Pew. They established these pretty advanced city-states, starting way back in the 2nd century BCE. And through trade with India, they adopted Theravada Buddhism, which would become a huge part of the region's identity. What's really fascinating is that early Chinese records describe the Pew as this humane and peaceful people, for whom war was basically an unknown concept. At the same time, you had the Mon people setting up their own kingdoms down in the south. These early groups kind of set the stage, but they were eventually absorbed by a new group moving in from the north, the Bamar people, and they are absolutely central to the rest of this story. Now, this next era is where things get really interesting. It's all about the rise of these Bamar people and their repeated, almost cyclical success in building these massive, unified empires out of all the different peoples in the region. The first great unification came with the pagan kingdom. Its founder, a king named Anaratha, managed to bring the whole Irrawaddy Valley under one rule and made Theravada Buddhism the state religion. This sparked a golden age of faith. In the capital, Bagan, they built over 10,000 temples. It was just this breathtaking landscape. But that very devotion ended up being its downfall. You see, as more and more land was donated to tax-free monasteries, the crown's money just dried up, which left it wide open to the Mongol invasions that eventually just shattered the empire. So fast forward a few centuries of fragmentation, and what happens? The cycle repeats itself. The Taungoo dynasty rises up and reunites the country. But under its most famous king, Bainong, it did way more than that. It just exploded into the largest empire in the entire history of Southeast Asia. The problem was, this huge, overextended empire was really just held together by personal loyalty to him. So almost immediately after he died, the whole thing unraveled and collapsed under its own weight. And then, one last time, a new dynasty, the Konbaung, rose from the ashes. This was a really militaristic, very centralized kingdom that successfully reunified Burma again. But that military focus drove it to expand westward. And in conquering new territories, it pushed its border right up against a formidable new neighbor, British India. This expansion basically set it on an unavoidable collision course with a global superpower. This clash with the British wasn't just another war or some shift in power. It was the most dramatic, most transformative break in Burmese history, and it brought 1,000 years of independent rule to a sudden end. Over about 60 years, the British Empire just systematically took the Konbaung kingdom apart. It wasn't one big event. It happened over 3 separate wars. In the first, they grabbed coastal territories. In the second, they annexed a vital southern province. And then finally, in 1885, they took what was left, sent the last Burmese king into exile, and ended the country's sovereignty for good. And this slide, wow, it just perfectly shows the sheer scale of the change. Britain didn't just rule Burma, it completely remade it. The monarchy was gone. The historic link between religion and the state was severed. The entire economy was rewired to just export rice as a province of British India. But maybe the most crucial thing, for their own administrative convenience, the British sharpened and highlighted the differences between the country's ethnic groups. They created these deep divisions that would have absolutely devastating, long-lasting consequences. Okay. So, after World War II, the dream of independence finally became a reality. But this incredible moment of triumph was immediately overshadowed by a national tragedy that would, honestly, define the country for generations to come. The architect of modern Burma was this nationalist hero Aung San. He was a master negotiator, securing an agreement for independence from the British. But just as important, he convinced many of the country's diverse ethnic groups to join this new union through what was called the Panglong Agreement. But then, just 6 months before Independence Day, on July 19, 1947, Aung San and most of his cabinet were assassinated. It left the brand new nation totally leaderless at the most critical moment imaginable.
With that central trusted leadership just gone, the fragile unity he had built just shattered. The country almost immediately spiraled into a complex, brutal civil war, with all these different ethnic and political factions fighting for control. It's a conflict that, in so many ways, has never really ended.
This deep-seated instability created a huge power vacuum, and the military was more than willing to fill it. They seized control, promising to bring order, but instead, they delivered decades of isolation and repression. The 1962 coup was swift, it was decisive, it just snuffed out Burma's brief experiment with democracy. A one-party state was established under something called the Burmese way to socialism. The entire economy was nationalized, industries were seized, and the country was basically sealed off from the rest of the world. For decades, the military crushed any and all dissent. But by 1988, after years of economic ruin and growing frustration, the country finally reached a breaking point. And that moment is symbolized by this one single iconic date, August 8, 1988. What was the trigger? Well, the government suddenly declared that most of the country's currency was worthless. Overnight. It just wiped out people's entire life savings. That was the final straw. What started as student protests just exploded into a nationwide pro-democracy movement with millions of people in the streets. But the military's response was just ruthless. They opened fire on the crowds, killing thousands and brutally crushing the uprising. Now we move into the modern era, and you'll see that historical cycle of hope followed by tragedy, well, it repeated itself once again. A brief window of democracy opened, only to be violently slammed shut. After decades of struggle, an incredible moment of hope arrived in 2015. Aung San's own daughter, Aung San Suu Kyi, a Nobel laureate who'd spent years under house arrest, led her party to a massive landslide election victory. You can see it right here. The result was just an undeniable mandate for change. But the transition to democracy was so fragile. The military still held a huge amount of power behind the scenes. And the government's reputation was severely damaged by its handling of the horrific Rohingya crisis in 2017, which involved the violent persecution of the country's Rohingya minority. But even with all those challenges, the NLD won another huge victory in the 2020 elections. The military, though, simply refused to accept the result. And then on February 1st, 2021, the military staged another coup. They arrested Aung San Suu Kyi and the country's other civilian leaders, threw out the election results, and plunged Myanmar right back into a violent civil war. It's just a tragic repeat of the country's history, and it leaves us with this profound and so far unanswered question about its future. So, why does all this matter? Well, because understanding these deep-rooted historical cycles of unification, division, and conflict is absolutely crucial to making any sense of the headlines we see coming out of Myanmar today. To keep exploring the complex histories of other nations, be sure to watch the next video in our Quick Country Histories playlist and subscribe to Notebook Summaries. Thanks for watching!